This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
My thesis is an examination of the social and cultural significance of the apple and the orchard, and I'm also one of the founders of a community orchard back in Cambridge, and that work was the impetus for my research, for my becoming a PhD student, since I became interested in the concept of heritage apple varieties and what this might mean. Now, the National Trust has informed me that if you have 3 apple trees, that is enough to constitute an orchard. But orchards are usually created on a grander scale, although it's nice to know that you can have one on your patio at home. Until the 1950s, when tree heights were lowered to allow mechanised fruit picking, orchards were large areas with big trees. In these private enclosed spaces underneath these trees, family and community rituals could occur, as well as obviously more prosaic activities such as keeping pigs, chicken or sheep, or underplanting with soft fruit. But even commercial orchards such as this one, which is an old surviving orchard in Cambridgeshire, have an aesthetic attraction, and the sensual appeal of blossom and then of the ripe fruit has been acknowledged in art and advertising for centuries. As I shall discuss, the symbolism of trees, and of the apple in particular, has turned the humble orchard into an emotionally resonant space. My central argument is that the real orchard, like this one, existing in physical time and space, holds within it the emotions elicited by the cultural, literary, symbolic orchard, and in particular by the apples grown there. Growers and consumers in Victorian England, as now, were aware of elements of the cultural history of the apple and the orchard, and representations of these spaces could not therefore be emotionally neutral. Apples are impermanent, consumable objects. As was discussed this morning, nothing survives of an apple, although obviously you can have apple corers and apple presses and so on. But each one of those apples that we've eaten carries a weight of symbolism, an often contradictory emotional charge. And my research is concerned with how that symbolism was expressed in Victorian culture, and how apples and orchards came to represent, in part, Victorians' values and beliefs in many areas, from the more obvious, such as the changing nature of the countryside, to the more opaque, the role of women, and the importance of myth in forging and binding a collective identity. My work is also an exploration of how material culture is expanding, I am glad to say, to include food, ingredients and recipes. I'm drawing on historical research into sensual memories and experience, and demonstrating how social history can be tracked through changes in taste, and by which I mean literal culinary taste. I love the name of this apple. It's called a hoary morning. Now, every apple tree growing is a scion from the original parent tree of that variety. It's grown on, it's propagated by grafting. Apples don't grow true from a pick. So the apple that you bite in today is a direct material living connection to that time when the original hoary morning tree was bearing fruit. So an orchard is full of the past. An apple is full of the past when you eat it. Many varieties of apple that are currently in cultivation were developed by Victorians, both amateurs and commercial fruit growers, and I believe that some of them exhibited at the Great Exhibition. And the qualities they admired in their fruit can give an insight into the Victorian diet, gardening practices, and perhaps into what qualities, what emotions the Victorians esteemed. There's many Pomona's books listing and illustrating the varieties of apple, and that's where this one comes from. And they often ascribe almost human qualities to the trees and their fruit, describing them, for example, as handsome or well-behaved. The place where these value trees were cultivated was therefore special as well, but the significance of orchards goes back before the first cultivated fruit crops. Orchards are managed landscapes that nevertheless cross the boundary between the native, the existing wild wood, and the safe enclosed garden, which came over time to be seen as increasingly feminine space. Apple trees have been imbued with significance as carriers of mystery, folklore and ritual. Even a new community orchard, and this is mine in Trumpington, Cambridge, growing young specimens of historic and, as they are called, heritage apple varieties, is planted with the intention to create an aesthetically pleasing space that will awaken particular emotions such as peace, contentment, and a feeling of nostalgia for more innocent times. An orchard can be understood as a deliberately planted grove of fruit trees. Orchards are usually enclosed with walls, hedges, or other closely planted trees. In East Anglia, cherry trees or cherry plums mark the boundaries. Within that space, an atmosphere can gather, and I believe that Victorian artists and cultural commentators use their knowledge of two interconnected stories of the history of sacred trees to appreciate and draw out the particular emotional resonances of an orchard. Forest groves have been awarded sacred significance through historic roots that interlock like branches but are yet separate. These can be delineated in very Victorian terms as the Christian and the pagan attitude to trees. In the visual arts, both ideas have been used to create emotional responses in viewers. In such depictions, the image of the apple itself has even more symbolic freight than that of the orchard or the tree. She had to be here. This is Christ, Adam and Eve. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as described in the Bible, is not an apple tree. There is a Hebrew word for apple, and the fruit in Genesis is not so specified. Nor is it in the King James translation, which describes the fruit of the tree as good for food and pleasant to the eyes. And the only species mentioned in the whole story is the fig. But the artists, certainly in Northern Europe, probably chose the apple because it was recognisable to their congregations in cold, dark, smoky churches who were looking at these first early representations of biblical stories. But it was also used because it linked in with indigenous stories and folklore familiar to these new Christians. In the early medieval period, it was a time when artistic representations of Christian themes were in flux, but the link between Eve and the apple was determined very quickly and remained as a constant throughout the centuries. That's the Victorian, very repentant Eve. Eve became a symbol of sexual womanhood, of all the characteristics that were considered to be weaknesses or faults of the female nature: deviousness, trickery, guile, inconstancy, faithlessness, and sexual enthusiasm. Thus Eve became the opposite to the Virgin Mary, and both being necessary to hold the idea of the other in symbolic terms that they're a pair. Now, the Virgin was both represented by and depicted within the hortus conclusus, which means the enclosed garden, and the phrase comes from the Song of Solomon. This is an allegorical enclosed garden of flowers and fruit trees. This garden was the promise of the new Eden, and so the apple was redeemed from Eve's original sin by growing within it, and man was redeemed from original sin by the coming of Christ. Here, in Carlo Crivelli's highly symbolic Annunciation of 1486, you can see, jostling among all the other symbols, there is a clear apple at the bottom of the picture. It's just spilling out at the bottom as you look on the paving stones there, and the scale of this is such that you're sort of drawn into the perspective of it. So there is the apple down the bottom. And back or forward to the pre-Raphaelites, those Victorian masters of symbolism, and another allegorical orchard. This is Holman Hunt's Light of the World, and it shows Christ emerging from a background of a neglected, rotting orchard, a fallen Eden. And you can see I've put up the detail there, the windfall apples underneath his feet. So this is the background that he's emerging from. But the worship of trees, of groves, woodlands, orchards, and other sacred and different spaces goes back far beyond Eden and the biblical Eve. These older ideas suffused the orchards of the 19th century and have survived today, transformed into folk rituals such as this wassail of slightly dubious authenticity. They're a lot of fun, though. This is a Sumerian chief goddess with her counterpart. She's the one with the horns, and interestingly the serpent, which is a symbol of her wisdom. That's the goddess there. and her son is her consort. She's the creator of every living thing, so that's why he is both. Now she dates from approximately 2500 BC, and the way the god and goddess are sitting either side of this tree, there's something in her relaxed pose that brings to mind Cranach's earlier Eve. She's offering the fruit out. There's no guilt here. The knowledge the adept gains is a gift from the divine. Now in the 19th century, obviously these early civilizations were being explored, excavated and analysed. Archaeology and anthropology were gaining status and expertise. And James Fraser, in The Golden Bough, which was finally published at the end of the Victorian era, drew searching parallels between various non-Christian myths and beliefs and the narratives of the Old and New Testaments. And he begins his investigation at the start of the book with a description of a murderous act of worship taking place in a sacred grove in Italy before the formation of the Roman Empire. And the idea of tree worship linked to sacrifice is one that came down to the Victorians not only through that line, but from their studies of Norse culture and the folk beliefs of the Baltic and Celtic countries. And as we were been discussing earlier this morning, apples can be, were often given as love tokens. Again, it's sort of partly that to Eve, but also partly because it's a fruit, it's got seeds in it. And interestingly, for what John Stars was saying, they were often tied with ribbons, so they were often linked with ribbons, and wassail bowls were decorated with ribbons as well. So lots of lovely folk beliefs that the Victorians were starting to explore and rework and also sanitise. If the orchard had its anarchic pre-Christian origins, the remaining wild wood, the natural forest that was seen as native to Britain, was even less safe. In Victorian times, it was both physically and symbolically the abode of the other. Outlaws and prophets alike, builders of alternative communities, sought sanctuary in the New Forest and other woodlands. For example, there was a group called the Girlingites, or the Hordle or New Forest Shakers, and they were founded by a very working class woman called Mrs. Girling, and she wanted to try and found a new Eden in the New Forest. But as you can just see in this rather bad reproduction, they ended up destitute and shelterless in a very harsh winter, mocked by their former supporters. And you can just see them huddling outside the farmhouse at that side there, and the snow is coming down a lot around them. But at the same time, the wild landscape became increasingly appreciated and celebrated in art, with a romantic movement emphasising the links between natural features and desirable emotional states, particularly awe and wonder, transcending the everyday and linking the appreciative viewer to the divine. And the romantic movement, certainly in Britain, was in part a reaction against what was perceived to be an ill-thought-out eagerness for full-on industrialisation and the changes that urban expansion of manufacturing brought upon the natural landscape. Victorian art makes use of orchard motifs to mourn the loss of the pre-industrialised rural community. Orchards are a place where the family works in harmony. Gathering the fruit is depicted as an idyllic way to pass the late summer and early autumn days, with the innocence of childhood protected, far from the urban slums. Pre-Raphaelite art goes beyond this, looking for a lost England of feudal stability and a gentle, gracious way of life where labour, craftsmanship and beauty were appreciated. Although the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a radical movement, both in its artistic aims and in political terms, it's too easy these days for us to interpret these images as nothing more than prettiness. However, this is a typical example that uses the visual language of the Hortus Conclusus and the orchard to bring about an emotional response in the viewer, a sympathy for the painter's longing for this pattern of life, however far into the imagined past it may be. The PRB and other Victorian painters use woodland, apple and orchard images to forge a strong collective past for the country, elevating the myths of Merry England. This is the England of wassailing ceremonies in orchards, and part of the reason for the popularity of community orchards today is in that word, community. A new orchard is born with the emotional baggage of instantly being part of the collective folk heritage of the British Isles. Trees, therefore, could be beyond the bounds of the safe, agricultural, productive, process landscape. Woodlands could represent sanctuary from the city and an escape into the past, but also an area of uncertainty where hierarchies are broken or inverted. For example, Mrs. Girlin, a working class woman, having control over a flock of people. So the orchard, on the boundaries of gardens, occupying a space between agricultural land and the wild landscape, has a shifting liminal identity. It's a productive space that is used as an image of peace and tranquility. An orchard can be the picture of innocent rurality, but there is something darker in the shadows. Apples can be cultivated and harvested with little effort, but did every bite of the fruit remind that Victorian consumer of the first sin and the Eden, both pre-lapsarian and pre-industrial, that was lost so long ago?